Time for an update on the Boardman Team FS. I've had this bike for 3 years from new, and in truth there isn't a lot more to say about it. It's still a great bike, and the fact that I'm still riding it around testifies to that. I'll say a bit about the various changes I've made in a while, but I thought it might also be useful to talk a bit about the business of riding in case you're looking to buy a bike like this. It didn't take me long to realise that most of the advice available from specialist sources such as mountain bike magazines or online forums was pretty unhelpful. And just as an example, I'm quoting from a book I've got here called Mountain Biking Written, where it says that bridleways are generally not as much fun as single track routes, as they're normally quite flat and featureless, but they're definitely preferable to forest roads, also described as fire roads. Now I would question this on points of fact. I know plenty of interesting bridleways, for example, but this is obviously written from a point of view, and like much of what you'll read about mountain biking, it presumes you're in it for the speed and the thrills. If you are, well, okay, but if like me you just want to be outdoors and explore the countryside, you're going to get a lot of poorly targeted advice charitably and probably end up spending a lot more money than you need to. Now, I'm not intending this to be a buyer's guide either, so let's move on. I generally plan a bike ride by trying to figure out a loop on the Ordnance Survey map. These are the Explorer maps, 1 to 25,000, and the rights of way are marked in green. On a bike you can basically ride anything with long dashes. On Land Ranger maps, which are the 1 to 50,000 scale, rights of way are pink, or magenta you might say. So I'll typically look for a loop anything from about 5 to 20 miles long, and if it's a new one to me I'll put it onto my GPS. This is an Oregon 450 with the Land Ranger OS maps on it, and I can enter the routes onto it using Basecamp, a free program from Garmin. It's not a great program, but it does what you need it to, and as far as I know it's the only one available to do this kind of offline planning. It would be nice if there was a proper iPad version, but there isn't. Once it's on the GPS I can use this as a quick reference on the bike. Obviously it's a good idea to have the proper map along too, as the Garmin screen isn't very big. And of course once I've ridden a new route a couple of times I don't need the GPS anymore. So let's have a look at the bike. All the mechanical parts are original. You know, I don't ride that much, and so I've basically just needed to change the tyres and the brake pads. I've also changed the handlebars. These are 71 centimetre bars, I think, considerably wider than the originals, and they've also got a 65mm rise on them. This looks a bit odd, but it gives me a better riding position, particularly when standing up on the pedals, which I do most of the time. For when I'm not standing up I've added a more comfortable saddle. Now this is where people will go on about weight, and yes, this saddle's heavier than the original, but honestly the difference doesn't seem all that important to me. I've got Gurgaon Grips on the bars. These are ergonomically shaped and they're much more comfortable than tubular grips. These ones have the little cow horns on the outside which give you a bit of variation, but actually I haven't found these much use in practice, and I've got the basic Gurgaon Grips on my other bike. What else? Oh yeah, I've got mudguards on this bike. That's a no-brainer you might think, but there's a real snobbish attitude among many mountain bikers about mudguards. And if you question this you'll often get some spurious explanation. The mudguards clog up with mud and increase the weight of the bike is a typical rationale. It's also not true. If you ride this bike on sticky mud, like any bike, it picks up mud on the tyres. So what happens is the tyres get clogged up and they just pick up steadily more mud until the bike weighs twice as much, and the wheels will eventually stop turning because the mud jams in the forks and the chain stays. So nothing to do with the mudguards. I suspect the reason serious mountain bikers don't use mudguards is that they snap them off a lot, so no rocket science there. I'm going to talk more about tyres in a minute, but let's see. I've got Dmr Volt Pedals on this bike, which are nice wide flat pedals with screw-in studs. Now you can put these studs in two different ways. I've got them in the conservative way, which means they don't stick out too far. And that's about it, apart from the various brackets here and there for lights and for the GPS. So let's talk about the tyres. The main job of the tyres is to keep the wheels going where we want them to, and it makes sense to use different tyres according to terrain and season, of course. Now again, I'm not usually flying around at 100 miles an hour in highly technical ways, and so I'm not going to be pushing my tyres to the limits. My basic priority is not falling off, and in my experience falling off is inevitably about the front tyre cutting loose, so that's the more important one to think about. These are my winter tyres. The front ones are fairly pricey dual compound tyre, and you'll see it's fairly knobbly. It's also quite a heavy tyre, but it's pretty safe on a lot of different kinds of terrain. This is a 2.35 inch tyre, by the way, but you should see there's plenty of clearance on this RockShox fork. The back tyre is a much cheaper one. This is a Continental Baron, and it's also quite knobbly. This is a 2.3 inch tyre, although it is quite slim. There isn't quite as much room at the back for a big tyre, but this one fits okay. Of course, the tyres are also part of the suspension. When you first buy a mountain bike, even a dual suspension one like this, you might be disappointed the first time you ride it on rough terrain because it still feels rough. Now the job of that front shock, and the rear one too if you have one, is to let the wheel be pushed out of the way when it hits a bump while the bike keeps moving in a straight line. Now if the shocks were doing their job perfectly, you'd be moving in a perfectly straight line with the wheels rising and falling over bumps and into holes, but there's a limit on how quickly they can do this, and so on ground where there's a lot of small bumps coming at you quickly, tractor ruts are a classic example on bridleways, the suspension doesn't do much of anything. But if you tune the tyre pressures suitably, you can get a much better ride over this kind of ground because the tyres conform to the terrain much faster than the mechanical shocks can. So don't be tempted just to run your tyres at whatever pressure they were pumped up to when you got the bike, which is likely 40 or 50 psi. It's good to experiment with lower tyre pressures. Suspension setup gets very technical, and I'm not going to talk much about it here, mainly because I don't really know a lot about the technicalities. But essentially you're always trying to find a compromise between how quickly the shock lets the wheel move out of the way and how quickly the bumps are arriving one after another. And that's because the shock has to push the wheel back to its starting point before the next bump arrives, or things won't work properly. Anyway, I'm not going to say any more about suspension, except to say that for my purposes this bike's really over-specified. I've ridden all the same routes on a hardtail, and it's clear I don't really need a rear shock, although it doesn't do any harm. It does bob a little bit under pedalling, and you can't lock it, but you can increase the stiffness by pumping it up. On the front I've got 130mm of travel, which is really way more than I need. 100mm shock is fine for this kind of riding, maybe even less. But again, it doesn't hurt to have more. It's nice to have an air adjustable shock, and this one can be locked out. Now I've had the remote lockout fitted as well, which makes that a little bit more convenient. Maintenance wise, there isn't a lot to say. I keep the chain well oiled. I clean mud out of the rear cogs after a muddy ride, and I've replaced the brake pads a couple of times. I've got 3 different sets of tyres I swap around on the bike, and of course I've had to buy lots of inner tubes and patches. Punctures are a way of life when you ride on bridleways, especially when the farmers cut their hedges, and you soon get used to it. The only thing that's gone wrong is the remote lockout stopped working, and that was down to a stripped screw thread that likely happened when it was installed. The gear shifting's a bit fiddly to get adjusted smoothly, and maybe I'll try fully enclosed cables to sort that out at some point. There's been a model revision since I bought this bike, and so the current Spec Team FS is a bit different to this one, notably for having 650B wheels. Those are bigger wheels, in case you don't know. Apart from that, the general design and specs about the same. For this type of riding, maybe it's overkill, but as a tough all-round bike I'd certainly recommend it.